Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now if you're new to the channel, my name is Angel David Basilio. I'm a realtor here in the Las Vegas area. Honestly, just wanted to help you guys get some good information when it comes to the markets. So if you're into financial advice, the housing market, if you live here in Las Vegas, want to become a homeowner or are a homeowner, I definitely recommend subscribing down below and giving this video a like because it really helps out the channel. Now if you clicked on this video, it's because you want to learn more about the market, and honestly, it's a really confusing time right now when it comes to the housing market. And the thing is that this encompasses everything outside the market too, as far as international affairs go, and everything comes into play. So there's so many different variables that it can really get confusing on what is even actually happening. Right now, there's a huge inflation problem. So if let's say here, if you're a sneakerhead like me, let's say that we have a shoe that comes out. Nike comes out with a shoe, right? And let's say that shoe, there's only 5 of them out there in the world. Well, then if you were to get your hands on one of those, it's super valuable. But if let's say there's 500 of those shoes, it's still super valuable because it's only 500, but it's less valuable. Now, let's say there's 50,000 of those same shoes out there, then no one really cares if you have that shoe. I mean, it's still cool, but it doesn't matter as much as if you had only 5 of those shoes out right there. So that's inflating. That's a lot of the same thing out there, so the value goes down, and that's what inflation is in simple terms. It's important to know that because as we go back in time, because a lot of people like to reference how we are right now with 2008, and there's parallels, but there's a lot of things that differentiate the two. Now, when it comes to the crisis of 2008, the reason why it became such a huge problem is because people were getting houses they could not actually afford. A lot of these banks, they really wanted to sell more of these loans. In order to get more loans out there, people need to be approved for those loans. Now, people who didn't have a secure job, there was no security on their income, people who had really bad credit scores, people who didn't really know what they were getting themselves into by getting adjustable rate mortgages, which just means that your rate can go up and down depending on the market, which means that you could, let's say, have a 3% rate on your house that you get originally, but then in like 2 years, if it goes up to 5%, well then you have to pay that 5%, which is a dramatic difference when it comes to your monthly expenses if you're not prepared for that. So what ended up happening was that a lot of people started getting these houses that they could not afford. This can only last for so long because they have to pay for their mortgage. Somebody has to pay for all these houses and these loans. A good way to understand this as a whole, I highly recommend watching the movie The Big Short. It's a really good watch because then you can understand the full encompass, because I'm kind of generalizing this because I don't want to make this video too long. So then what happening is that no one was paying their mortgages, people were getting foreclosed on, and it became a huge mess. Everyone started losing their houses, and so that's what inevitably made the huge crash. Now, that is impossible for it to happen again because the government puts laws in place that make it so that banks can't do that anymore. There is like no similarities when it comes to the crash that could potentially happen now versus what could happen, versus what did actually happen in 2008, because we don't have that issue of people buying houses they can't afford. Actually, right now, it's harder to get pre-qualified because the interest rates have been going up. Going back to the idea of the inflation, right? When it came to the inflation, the reason why it started was because back when we had the quarantine happen, see, the coronavirus really hit everybody in the mouth and no one was really predicting it. I mean, yeah, there were some, but a majority of the people weren't really predicting what was actually going to happen with this, because yes, a big deal of it was that people were getting sick and it's health over like any type of financial thinking, but finances always come into play back sometime eventually. So with the quarantine, businesses were closing down. So therefore, they didn't have a whole lot of money getting passed around. There was no money being given nor earned because people weren't working, at least ones that didn't have essential workplaces. Now with that in mind, in order to get the economy going again, they have to inflate it by putting money out there by using stimulus checks and unemployment checks. Now that was happening, but the unfortunate part is that in the short term, people did have money, but in the long term, now there was more money in the market, so the value of your dollar went down, which just means that now that we're in 2022, we're feeling the effects of that. People who bought houses in 2020, there was like a rise in home ownership. Not by a whole lot, but there was enough. Now, when you go into 2021, now it becomes this issue where, okay, so all of the housing prices go up because now people have more money, which means the value of their dollar goes down. So that means they have to put more down on the same house. Now, interest rates were super, super low at like 2 to 3% back in 2020, 2021-ish. That's a number that's unrealistic. If you actually go back during the 2000 era, actually interest rates, if you wanted a good interest rate, was actually 7%. So now that we're in 5%, it doesn't sound that bad, but it's all about that perspective. So now that interest rates are going back to 5% in 2022, it is becoming an issue of like, okay, now we were comfortable with those interest rates and now we're going back up. So it feels like it's a lot, even though it's not. So with the housing prices going up, people are not really getting qualified as much as they could. And on top of that, they have to raise interest rates to slow down inflation, because inflation was really, really bad. It's still really bad. There's not enough houses out there in the market. The supply is really low, because with all these people throwing out money on these houses, that means the inventory gets lowered and demand goes up, unless the inventory can keep up with it, but they can't, because the cost of building has been a lot more expensive. So you see how this kind of gets into an issue. Now, in a national point of view, what we created was huge inflation. In order to fight that, we have to have huge interest rates for this to go down. But if we look back in time with 2008, once the crash happened and nobody had any money, what they did was that they inflated the market by putting more money out there. Back in the quarantine, when there was nobody having money, they inflated the market by putting more money out there by giving out stimulus checks. So the solution tends to be where if there's a recession, you must throw money in it so people have money to start using to build up the economy. But what happens when the issue of the recession is caused by inflation, the thing that they use to get out of a recession? So if you're a home buyer, you have to go through the issue of that the housing prices are way more expensive, and then there's just the gas prices that have been going up, groceries, and then the interest rates are up. Now, of course, it gets more complicated than that, because you also have international affairs. So the gas prices and everything and the inflation, that was already our issue. But now it becomes an even more complicated issue when you start to look overseas with the war. So you start to wonder, okay, so is it even worth it to buy a house? Do I just not buy a house? Well, the thing is that it's not that quite simple. So housing, the way it works is supposed to be the most stable, because it's something that you can physically feel, you can touch it, you can, build it up, and it doesn't go down in value the way cars do. So it's supposed to be a safer option, and it is. Regardless of what happens in the market, even though people thought it was the end of the world in 2008 and nobody had money, after 2008 happened, and when we go on to later years in 2013, everything went back to normal. And it's because even though people thought in 2008 that was the end of the world and that nobody was gonna have money anymore, as you saw when we got to 2013, the housing prices went up again. And even during the Great Depression of 1930, even though everyone thought it was the end of the world, we came out of that with housing prices going up. So regardless of what the market does, housing is always going to go up in value, but you cannot look at it at the short term. You have to look at the long term and what's it going to be in 5 to 10 years. If you just look at it from like 2 years, yeah, your housing, just like stocks, is not going to do very much. And you might feel a little bit concerned about that, but you have to look at the grand scheme of things. And no matter what happens, things always go back into motion and your housing goes up again. So even if you do purchase a house that's relatively expensive right now, it might go down once inflation goes down, but then it will go back up, because that's just the natural order of things, and that's how it's supposed to be when it comes to the market. It goes up, then it goes down, and then it goes up, and then it goes down. But if you look at the long term, it always goes up. If you're a home buyer, yeah, still buy a house. I wholeheartedly recommend it. And if you want to know the difference between buying a home versus renting a home and the benefits of buying a home, I recommend checking out this video that I'll list up here. Again, there are a lot of things that I'm haven't mentioned and a lot of details, and it's because this video is supposed to be generalizing and kind of just showing you the grand scheme of things, so you can understand how the history influenced how things are today, and how you can use that to understand what's happening right now. Because in order to understand what's happening right now, you have to understand the history, because that way history won't repeat itself and you can learn from the mistakes of the past. Definitely hit the like down below if you got value from this. Leave your comments down below, your thoughts, questions, or anything. And I highly recommend adding information or even correcting me on some information that I may have given incorrectly, because the point of this is to give out information. So if I'm ever saying anything that's not exactly the truth, let me know down below, because then way we can correct it and everybody can else know. And I want to build a community on understanding this information and what we can do about it. But anyways, I really, really appreciate your time, taking your time out of your day to watch this video. I sincerely appreciate it. Hope you got some value out of it, and I will see you on the next video.